So what I'm going to do now is continue our discussion about parallel programming, and we're going to talk about when to apply parallelism in practice. And in particular, it doesn't always pay off to use parallelism, so you need to know what conditions need to hold in order to be able to use parallel programming as your preferred programming paradigm. First and foremost, parallelism is not a panacea, and that's particularly the case when there's contention for shared resources. This is a funny little meme that shows the difference between parallelism in theory, where each thing runs independently and has no coordination or dependencies on anything else, and what sometimes happens if you're not careful and you use it in practice, where things collide and have to contend for resources and so on. Parallelism works best under certain conditions. Condition number one, when tasks are independent. I've used this example quite a number of times now, but remember, when you think about independent tasks, think about doing your laundry in the laundromat, where each washer can go in parallel, each dryer can go in parallel. There's really no dependencies other than needing to get your clothes out of the washer to put them in the dryer. This is commonly referred to as embarrassingly parallel task programming, or parallel programming. And what that means in a nutshell is that these tasks have little or usually no dependencies or need to communicate between each other, or to be able to share results between each other until everything is finished and we combine and reduce everything into a final result. The word embarrassingly in this context is meant to be something like an embarrassment of riches, meaning an overabundance or too much of a good thing. It's not actually embarrassing. It's great when you have an embarrassingly parallel program. But this is the term that you'll find in the art to talk about this particular way of doing things. Remember, the whole point is to be able to split things up into separate subtasks and then run them all together. Each subtask runs sequentially, but the whole gamut of them run together in parallel, and then you merge the results back together. Another circumstance, another condition where parallel processing works effectively is when there's lots of data and lots of processing to perform. So you've got a whole bunch of things to work on. So those of you who may be familiar with the terracotta army in China, you have lots of things to work on in parallel. Obviously, somebody had to spend a lot of time building these things. Undoubtedly, it was done in parallel. I have a hard time believing one person made all those terracotta army warriors. Let's talk about a way of estimating when it could be useful to apply parallelism. This is something that's called the N times Q heuristic, which is defined by a guy named Brian Getz in this article and elsewhere. And in this heuristic, we talk about N being the number of data elements to process, where N is the number, pretty typical use of N. And then Q, which is a little bit more mysterious, is really a quantification of the CPU processing intensity for each data element. So N times Q is the model. Now, if you've got low N and low Q, in other words, you don't have very many items and it doesn't take long to process them, then there's really not a whole lot of point in using parallelization due to the overhead incurred trying to set up the parallel processing, splitting and then joining later. In such a case, it's usually best just to stick with sequential programming if N is low and Q is low. If N is high and Q is low, the overhead of parallelism may outweigh the benefits, since the computational workload for each element is trivial. So here's an example. If you have a function that sums the elements in an int array, then unless the length of that array is very large, then it's probably not worth doing this in parallel. Brian Getz, in his articles and books, recommends that N be greater than 10,000 or so before you really get a bang for your buck. Obviously, your mileage may vary on that, but the idea is you need a lot of something to make it worthwhile. Alternatively, what happens if you have a low N but a high Q? In that case, the computational workload for each data element is high. So often, even a small N can benefit from parallelization because the work can be partitioned across multiple cores for the small N. And because the Q is high enough, that may reduce the total time for computation. This is often seen in simulations, complex math computations, graphics rendering, etc. Here's a very simple example where we're computing the factorial of some value, and it turns out that that Could take a while, especially as that gets large. If this is really a big factorial with a big integer, it can get to be a long computation. So if you had a bunch of those things to do, then parallelism could probably provide you with somewhat of a win. However, the holy grail of all this stuff is high N, high Q. And in this case, the potential for parallel speedup is significant. So here's an example where we're going to have quite a large number, let's say 10,000. We could have more, of course, but at least 10,000 numbers. And we want to go ahead and check to see if those numbers are prime numbers, which takes a while for a large number. So this is a large number of large numbers, and we're going to check them for primality. And in that case, you would most definitely get a speed up from using parallel processing, because it's big number, big computation. Another condition under which it pays off to use parallel processing is when the tasks don't block, nor do they share mutable state. That's another way of saying that they're independent of each other. But another theme is not blocking. And in that situation, we'll end up with what Java's fork-join parallel processing model is about, which is avoid sharing mutable state. If you can do things separately in different fork-join tasks and never the twain shall meet, then you can speed things up and you don't have to worry about dealing with synchronization and so on, and contention is eliminated almost entirely. And there's also an opportunity for work stealing, which is another optimization that's provided, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But that's one of the features that's supported with the fork-join paradigm in Java. It is possible, by the way, to have blocking tasks, and we'll talk more about that. That's, in fact, what happens when you do things like download images in a web crawler of some kind, but it's even better if they don't block. And of course, it pays off if you have lots of cores and/or lots of processors, certainly lots of cores. So the more cores, the merrier. The more things you can have running in parallel without blocking, without sharing state, with lots of data, with lots of CPU-intensive tasks or processing-intensive tasks. And if the data is independent, that's the cases where parallelism really shines in practice. So that's a quick overview of when applying parallelism could be useful and what to consider, what factors to consider in order to see if it's going to work for you.